Let's talk power. The microcontroller that we're putting into the Lancer class Pursuit Craft is an AdaFruit Feather 328P, which is basically an Arduino with a power booster on it in a nice form factor. In fact, the 328P is actually the same chip that goes on an Arduino. So if you've ever done Arduino programming like in school, if you're one of the young kids, then this is exactly the same thing. Now, because there's no room to fit the 320p controller as well as the LED controller, and I do use a separate LED module simply because this gives me more PWM outputs than the 320p does, as well as a free resistor in there. Basically, I have to attach power through a pigtail, which is what we cut the hole in the bottom for earlier. So the 328P, because it does receive USB power or battery power, I can do one of two things. Either connect this battery through a jumper cable or a jumper wire into the power connector, or I could actually include a power module and provide 5-volt USB power to the 5-volt pins through this USB and ground pin somewhere over here. And that's what I'm going to do so that I can have this external power module be both the battery charger as well as the battery connector that kind of supplies that 5-volt power. It's a little less efficient stepping 3.7 volt batteries up to 5 volts then back down to 3.7 volts as opposed to just connecting it directly, but I do want the ability to charge the entire device from the outside. Now, all of the electronics for the battery and the charger are going to fit inside of the large base, and we have a 3D printed extension that's going to go underneath a standard large base that's about the same large base size, and I've designed it to also have the movement and bomb dropping nubs, if you will, where you put the templates. Before we connect the power module to a pigtail to go up into the body of the Lancer class Pursuit Craft, the first thing we want to do is wire on a power switch. Now the power switch does need to be external, which means that I'm going to need it, if I was looking at the base, to kind of be over here and the charger be over here. To make a power switch connect up to this thing, if you notice that there is a pin here labeled EN, where my fingers are, and one that's GND. And all the GNDs are what are called grounds. A lot of these power modules, especially the ones from AdaFruit, have some type of enable switch where if you tie that to ground, like if the switch is what we say closed, in other words, it's bridging the gap between enable and ground, it'll prevent power from leaving and going up into the Lancer class Pursuit Craft. It will still be able to charge while the switch is off, so that's a nice feature as well. To connect them, we're going to use these what are called JST-PH connectors. JST stands for Japan Solderless Terminal. It is a brand name. These are proprietary. They sell these connectors, and JST-PH tends to be pretty common in electronics. There are other form factors like JST-XH, which is larger, and this is what's called a JST-PH2 or 2PH because it has two pins. I don't really care about the colors right now, but generally speaking, you want black to be connected to any sort of ground and then red to be connected to any sort of live. But in this case, what we're just going to do is connect the red one to the EN and the black one to the ground over here. And I have a few more that I'm going to use to connect out later on, but let's do the power switch first. The reason why I've chosen this particular JST-PH, it just so happens that the pin width of the PH is the same as the pin width of the little slide switch that I've bought for this model. To solder all the parts together, I of course need a soldering iron, there's a couple of extra things that you probably want to have with soldering iron in addition to actual rosin core solder to make the whole thing go smoothly. Namely, you're going to want to have some type of copper braid or sponge that allows you to wipe off the excess solder, possibly some tip tinning things when you clean it, maybe a wet sponge, or a damp sponge rather. And I'm going to put a little bit of solder onto the tip itself. Now notice that I'm using a very, very fine tip. You don't want to use a very large tip, and you also want to keep the heat rather controllable. You know the iron's too hot when you touch this thing and you see the solder just completely evaporate. So let's start by taking a look at the thing that we're soldering on, which is this pigtail. The JST-PH pigtails that I bought actually are quite nice because they've already been crimped and the connectors have been attached. I'm not going to worry about that working with the crimping tool. And the wire itself is what's called braided or stranded wire, and that allows it to be extremely flexible. And this company was nice enough to go ahead and put a little bit of solder at the ends of the wires themselves. So I'll just cheat and jam these in here and solder them on the backside. Now, this is easiest to do with what are called helping hands, which are a fancy thing for basically just alligator clips on a stand. But I think I'm going to be able to get lucky. So I've got my iron heated. I've got a little bit of solder on it. It's kind of oxidized already, so I'll clean that off, get a little more on there. And then I'll just touch the solder tip where I have the blob of solder and a little more solder to where I want the joint to be. And it cools down quickly, and I notice that's already stuck in there, so that's good. You don't want to apply too much heat. Try to use as little heat as possible. And the rosin core solder will actually allow the rosin to flow onto the metal itself. So there I have my connector, and let's go ahead and test it out. So I will wire it up to, or connect the switch on. If it's on these two pins where the switch is, then the whole thing should be disabled. Then I'll connect my battery. And you'll notice the lights are off right now, which means that the battery is not running. And if I flip the switch, the light comes on, which means that it is supplying power. So there is my power switch for the base. The next thing I want to do is connect a pigtail that's going to lead up to connect to the other side where it's going to receive power. So this is going to look a lot like those drone batteries where you have two things that connect to each other. In this case, it's not going to be a battery connected directly to the input for the power over here, but it's going to be a 5-volt supply. So if I look on board the Powerboost, you'll see one pin that says 5V and one that says GND, and that's what I'm going to connect. Generally speaking, we want black to go to ground and red to go to power or any sort of hot signal. So once again, I'll use the same method. Now, in between solder operations, you typically want to unplug your soldering iron if you're not using it. You don't want it to just sit around and be hot. That's a big no-no. That'll kind of degrade the life of your soldering iron, or at least the tips. But remember that every time you do want to start with a clean, fresh soldering iron, and this is, it will use helping hands. No. So I'm going to clean it off and attach a little, put in a little solder. And that should work, hopefully. All right, that's one little bubble right there. And there's another little bubble right there. And unplug my iron. Okay. The question you might be asking is, how is this thing going to fit through any sort of small hole on the large base? If I have a large base, I don't really want to carve up a hole this big. The key here is that later on, I can actually pop out the plastic heading, and the metal, the actual headers will, or the crimped connectors will stay on. So if I wanted to, I could take a small screwdriver and pop off this guy very carefully. I don't want to break the tabs if I want to reattach them later on. Or I could get a fresh JSTPH male connector and just do it that way. But yeah, these are somewhat removable. So this will connect over here to this pigtail, and then we're going to want the other side to connect to the 5-volt and ground over here.